You're wearing clothes right now. You've worn clothes every single day of your life, probably since about 48 hours after you were born. It is so automatic, so completely unremarkable that you have almost certainly never once stopped to ask the actual question. Not why do we wear clothes? You know that. It's cold. It's Tuesday. Society has opinions. The real question is when. When did the first human look at a dead animal and think, I should be inside that? And what exactly pushed an entire species that had been walking around naked for hundreds of thousands of years over the edge? Because here's what most people get completely wrong. We treat clothing like an obvious invention. Of course humans figured out clothes. It's cold. You cover yourself. Problem solved. But that's not how it happened. The story involves an ice age, an evolutionary arms race, and scientists cracking the timeline not by finding ancient fabric. Fabric doesn't survive 100,000 years. But by studying lice. We'll get to that. First, the timeline. And the timeline is genuinely uncomfortable. Homo sapiens appeared in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. The best scientific estimates put the origin of clothing at somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago, which means there is a gap, a significant puzzling gap of up to 200,000 years during which modern humans, people with your brain, your cognitive capacity, your full emotional complexity, walked the earth without clothing, not primitive pre-humans, not evolutionary ancestors with smaller brains. People who were, neurologically and biologically, essentially you, naked, for up to 200,000 years, which completely destroys the obvious explanation. If clothing were simply a response to cold, it would have appeared much earlier. Humans were dealing with cold long before they invented clothes. So, cold alone wasn't the trigger. Something specific had to change first. To understand why clothing eventually became necessary, you need to understand why it wasn't. Our early hominid ancestors were hairy. Body hair is a thermal management system. It traps air near the skin, insulates against cold, protects against UV. It works reasonably well in a stable, warm climate. But around 1.5 to 2 million years ago, something interesting happened. Hominids started losing their hair, deliberately, evolutionarily losing it. Because they were becoming persistence hunters, runners, not the fastest creatures on the savannah, but the ones with enough endurance to chase prey for hours until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. That hunting strategy generates enormous heat, and body hair blocks the human cooling system, sweating. Sweat evaporating off exposed skin is extraordinarily efficient, but trapped under fur, it can't evaporate. So the hominids that lost more hair could cool themselves better, run further, eat more reliably, and survive more successfully. Evolution ran the calculation. Body hair out. 4 million sweat glands in. The result was a species perfectly calibrated for life in tropical Africa. Exposed dark skin, brilliant thermal engineering, and completely naked. For hundreds of thousands of years, that nakedness wasn't a problem. Africa was warm. The human body, stripped of hair, was perfectly designed for the environment it lived in. Until humans left. Between 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, groups of Homo sapiens began moving out of Africa. Not planned, not organized, slow generational drift. Groups moving slightly further than their parents, their children moving further still. Into the Middle East, into Asia, into Europe, into cold. Real cold. Ice Age cold. The world during this period was dramatically colder than today. Much of northern Europe and Asia was glaciated, winters longer, deeper, darker, and a naked human body, built for the African savanna, equipped with the thermal management system of a tropical hunter, had a serious problem. Your core temperature needs to stay within an incredibly narrow range to function. Drop below it, and you get hypothermia. Drop far enough, and you die. In Ice Age Europe, on a January night, with no shelter and no clothing, a naked human would not last long. So something had to change. Here's the question nobody asks. Why didn't it change sooner? Humans had been hunting large animals for hundreds of thousands of years before clothing appears. They had the intelligence to notice that animal fur was warm. They had stone tools capable of cutting hides. Every single prerequisite for making a basic garment existed long before clothing shows up in the record. So, what took so long? Because raw hide is not clothing. A skin peeled directly from an animal is stiff. It rots. It dries into something closer to cardboard. What makes hide into functional clothing is processing. Hide tanning, scraping it clean, working it extensively, treating it with animal brains or bark, smoking it to preserve flexibility, is labor-intensive, skill-intensive, and cognitively demanding. Making functional clothing doesn't just require the physical ability to make it. It requires a knowledge ecosystem. Accumulated, transmitted, culturally maintained knowledge passed deliberately from generation to generation. The cold provided the reason. The question was whether humans had the social infrastructure to develop the solution fast enough to survive. They did. And now, back to the lice. Human lice have been with us for millions of years. There are two types: head lice, which live in scalp hair, and body lice, which live in clothing, specifically in the seams and folds of fabric, coming to skin only to feed. Body lice are biologically a variant of head lice. They diverged from head lice at the specific point when humans started wearing clothes regularly enough that a population of lice could survive in fabric rather than hair. Because lice reproduce quickly and mutate at a consistent rate, their DNA functions as a biological clock. By comparing head lice and body lice genetics and calculating how long ago they diverged, scientists can estimate when humans started wearing clothing consistently enough to give lice a new viable habitat. The answer comes back to somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. That's the moment. Not when humans first grabbed a hide on a cold night, but when clothing became regular enough, culturally embedded enough, that lice evolved a subspecies to live in it. Lice, the organisms that cause school-wide panics and industrial quantities of medicated shampoo, are among the most precise archaeological tools we have for dating one of the most significant transitions in human history. The universe has a very specific sense of humor, but there's something most people completely miss about the origin of clothing. We've been talking about it as a thermal solution, a response to cold, accurate, real, but very far from the whole story. Because clothing didn't stay in the lane it was invented for. Almost immediately it became something else entirely. It became communication. At Sungir, a burial site in Russia dating to 34,000 years ago, archaeologists found two children buried side by side, covered in over 10,000 tiny ivory beads sewn onto their garments in elaborate decorative patterns. Each bead individually carved, drilled, and attached. The labor involved was staggering, completely disproportionate to any functional purpose. These children were dressed for status, dressed to communicate something about who they were, who their family was, what position they occupied in the social world, 34,000 years ago. That impulse, using what you put on your body to communicate who you are, is not a modern invention. It arrived with clothing itself. The functional and the symbolic came as a package deal, almost from the very beginning, and have never been separated since. Clothing began as survival. Humans moving into cold climates they were never biologically designed for, solving a thermal problem with knowledge and craft and tools. With eyed needles carved from bone, appearing around 50,000 years ago, enabling properly fitted, tailored garments that could seal against Arctic cold in ways that wrapped hides never could. The people who made those needles were craftspeople in the fullest sense, developing specialized skills, passing them forward, unlocking survival in environments that would otherwise have been fatal, not just enduring, innovating. And the moment they had the solution, they did what humans always do with any technology that touches the body and the social world. They loaded it with meaning. They made it carry messages about who they were, where they stood, what they believed, who they belonged to. Those children at Sungir, buried under 10,000 beads, were dressed in the same fundamental logic that every fashion house, every dress code, every military uniform, every wedding dress that has ever existed operates by. The logic that what you wear is not separate from who you are. It is part of the argument you make to the world about yourself. That logic is 34,000 years old, probably older. You are wearing clothes right now because somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago, A human being in a cold place covered themselves and survived. Their children survived. Their children's children survived and got better at it and passed the knowledge forward. And somewhere in that long, cold chain of problem and solution, the animal that had walked naked under the African sun became something new. Not just a survivor, a species that dresses. The gap between covering yourself because you're cold and dressing because of who you are, that gap is where culture begins. And you've been living inside it your entire life without ever once stopping to ask how you got there. Now you know.